What happens when the silence of a town is broken not by a sound, but by an accusation? What happens when that silence, once a symbol of peace, becomes the suffocating blanket for a lie? In a place called Harmony Creek, a town whose name had become a cruel irony, the silence was about to demand a price, paid in blood, under the cold, indifferent gaze of a moonless sky. The air, thick with the dust of a failed harvest and the bitter chill of autumn, carried the scent of pine pitch from burning. By torches, those torches held aloft by the hands of farmers and shopkeepers, men you'd normally see sharing a coffee at the general store, now cast long dancing shadows that turned familiar faces into monstrous masks of fury. They were a single entity, a beast with dozens of heads, and they were dragging a man from the simple wooden shack he called home. His name was Elias. He was not a large man, nor a loud one. His strength was not in his voice, which was rarely heard, but in his hands. They were a roadmap of his life, calloused, scarred, and stained with the grease of machinery and the dark, rich soil he worked from sun-up to sundown. His eyes, usually a gentle, weary blue, were wide now, not with the defiance of a cornered animal, but with the profound, shattering confusion of a man who could not comprehend the hatred directed at him. He stumbled on the uneven ground, his worn-out work boots scuffing against the dirt he had so dutifully tilled for another man's profit. He offered no resistance, his body limp in their grasp, as if his spirit had already conceded that this was a fight he could not win with quiet dignity or honest labor. He was thrown to the ground at the feet of the most powerful man in the county, Samuel Blackwood. Blackwood was a man carved from the same hard granite as the nearby hills, his face a permanent mask of grim authority, his wealth measured in acres, and the fear he commanded. He stood over Elias, his large frame blocking out the light from the torches, plunging the accused man into a deeper darkness. Then his voice, a low rumble that could quiet a saloon or command a workforce, boomed through the terrified night. Thief! The word was not just an accusation, it was a verdict and a sentence all in one. It echoed off the clapboard walls of the silent houses, a stone tossed into the still, dark pond of the community, and the ripples were waves of rage. The charge was laid bare for all to hear, the farm's entire harvest savings, a metal box filled with the cash that represented the town's very lifeblood, the money needed for seed in the spring, for supplies through the winter, for the thin thread of hope they all clung to, was gone, and Samuel Blackwood, in his righteous fury, had pointed his finger at the quietest, most solitary man among them. He had pointed at Elias. The mob, a single organism twitching with shared desperation and a hunger for simple answers to complex problems, needed no more proof than their leader's word. Their own fear was the only evidence required. They closed in, their circle tightening, the heat from their torches pressing in on Elias, stealing the very air from his lungs. The dust in Harmony Creek was more than just dirt. It was a constant presence, a character in their lives. It was the ghost of last year's failed crops, a fine brown powder that coated every windowsill, settled in the lines of every face, and made every breath a little harder. In the dry season, it hung in the air like a perpetual fog, blurring the edges of the world, making it easy to mistake a neighbor for a stranger, a shadow for a threat. This was a town living on the edge, where paranoia was as common as the crows in the cornfields, and into this dry, fertile ground of suspicion, the seed of an accusation had been planted, and it had taken root with terrifying speed. The dust was in their eyes, and they could no longer see the man, only the monster they were told he was. And from the doorway of the small shack, a silent scream tore through the night. It came from a little girl named Maya, Elias's daughter. She stood there, a small, fragile silhouette against the meager lamplight from inside, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes two dark pools of unimaginable horror. She made no sound, but her agony was the loudest thing in the clearing. It was a soundless wail of a world being ripped apart, of the one solid pillar in her life, her father, being torn down before her very eyes. For Elias, that silent scream was a physical blow, more painful than any fist or stone the mob could throw. It was the sound of his failure, the sound of the one promise he had made to his dying wife to protect their child, shattering into a million pieces. And you, watching this right now, have you ever felt that? Have you ever been in a situation where everyone around you had already made up their minds, where your truth was a whisper against a hurricane of judgment? That feeling when a lie, spoken with. Confidence becomes more real to people than a lifetime of quiet integrity. It's a unique kind of helplessness, a prison with no bars, where the jury is made up of the very people you once called your neighbors, your friends. If you have ever felt that sting of being judged without a trial, of having your character assassinated by whispers, then you know a fraction of the terror that was gripping Elias's heart in that moment. The mob's anger, fed by Blackwood's certainty, needed a release. Someone pointed to the ancient sprawling oak tree at the edge of the clearing, its thick branches like skeletal arms reaching for the black sky. It had stood there for 100 years, a silent witness to the town's births, festivals, and sorrows. Tonight, it was to be an instrument of a different kind of ceremony. A rough, thick rope was produced, its coiled form looking like a serpent in the torchlight. A young man, eager to prove his loyalty to Blackwood, shimmied up the trunk and tossed the rope over a sturdy limb. The sound it made as it scraped against the bark was a dry, rasping noise that cut through the murmuring of the crowd, a sound of finality. Elias watched them, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief. He had come to Harmony Creek 5 years ago seeking peace, a place to raise his daughter away from the ghosts of his past. He had kept to himself, worked harder than any 2 men, and asked for nothing but a fair wage and to be left alone. He believed that a man's work spoke for him, that his character was built in the sweat of his brow and the honesty of his labor. He had never understood that in a place like this, silence could be so easily mistaken for secrecy and humility for guilt. His quiet nature, the very thing he had cultivated as a shield, had become the weapon they were now using against him. His gaze drifted from the terrifying preparations at the tree and found his daughter, still frozen in the doorway. He saw not just a child, but the face of his wife, Maria. He remembered the promise he'd whispered to her on her deathbed, his hand on hers, her breathing shallow. "I'll give Maya a good life," he had sworn, "a life better than ours. She'll read books. She'll be safe." Now, that promise was turning to ash in his mouth. What life would she have after this? The daughter of a man branded a thief, a man hanged from a tree by his own neighbors. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it impossible to breathe even before. The rope found his neck. The noose, a crude but effective knot, was complete. 2 men, their faces grim and set, hauled Elias to his feet and dragged him towards the oak tree. He did not fight. What was the point? To fight them was to confirm their belief that he was a desperate, violent man. His only remaining currency was his dignity, and he would not let them take that. He walked the longest 10 yards of his life, each step an eternity, the faces of the crowd a blur of twisted features and cold, unforgiving eyes. He felt the rough fibers of the rope against the skin of his neck, a coarse, final embrace. He closed his eyes, a single hot tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. Samuel Blackwood stepped forward, his face illuminated by a torch, looking like a judge from a forgotten brutal time. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was the only signal needed. The men holding the other end of the rope tensed, their knuckles white as they gripped the hemp. The crowd fell into a deep, expectant hush. The only sounds were the crackle of the torches and the frantic, terrified beating of Elias's own heart. He was a good man, an honest man, a loving father. But in the court of mob rule, none of that mattered. The truth was whatever the powerful said it was. The rope began to tighten. It bit into his skin, a sharp, searing line of pressure that cut off his breath. His feet, which had stood on solid ground for his entire life, suddenly felt light, scraping against the dirt as the rope took his weight. His world narrowed to a pinprick of light, and in that light he saw Maya's face one last time. His life, measured in a lifetime of sunrises and hard work, was now being measured in the final, terrifying inches of a tightening rope. And in the suffocating silence of Harmony Creek, it seemed no one was coming to save him. The town was about to commit a sin from which it could never be cleansed, and the only innocent man there was about to pay the price for it. To understand what was happening under that ancient oak tree, to truly grasp the weight of the rope on Elias's neck, you must understand that this was not the end of his story, but the culmination of a life lived in the margins. His story did not begin in the dust of Harmony Creek, but in the endless rolling fields of a country that had taken his parents' labor and given them nothing in return. He was born into a life of movement, a ghost on the American landscape. His first, Memories were not of a home with solid walls, but of the back of a flatbed truck, the scent of diesel mixing with the sweet smell of peaches or the sharp tang of onions, depending on the season and the state. His world was defined by the horizon, a line he was always traveling toward but never reaching. He learned early that silence was a form of armor. In the migrant camps, a loud voice attracted the wrong kind of attention, from the crew boss, from the authorities, from men whose desperation had curdled into cruelty. A quiet man could observe, could work, and could disappear when the work was done. His father, a man broken by the sun long before his time, had taught him that with his fists. "Keep your head down and your hands busy," he would grunt, his voice rough as sandpaper. "The world doesn't want to hear your troubles, boy. It only wants what you can pull from the ground." Elias learned the lesson well. He learned the language of soil, the rhythm of the seasons, the mechanics of a tired engine. His hands became his voice, telling a story of tireless effort, of repairs made by moonlight, of a quiet competence that asked for no praise. Then came Maria. She was not from the fields. Her family had a small, failing diner in a town they passed through, a town just like 100 others. But she saw something in the quiet man with the grease-stained hands and the eyes that held the sadness of 1,000 miles of road. She saw the gentleness he hid from the world. She saw the man, not the laborer. For the first time, Elias felt seen. Her laughter was a sound he had never known, a melody that cut through the monotonous drone of his life. With her, he dared to dream a different kind of dream, not of wealth, but of stillness. The dream of a single patch of ground to call his own, of a roof that didn't move, of a place where his child could be born and not have to learn the geography of harvest routes. Their love was a brief, beautiful season of bloom in a life of drought. They saved every penny, living on next to nothing, their shared dream a fire that kept them warm against the cold winds of poverty. Maya was born from that dream, a perfect, tiny creature who held all their hopes in her small fists. But their season was short. A sickness came, a cough that settled deep in Maria's chest and never left. The doctors in the free clinics shrugged, offering remedies that did little against the relentless progress of the disease. Their savings, so carefully hoarded for a down payment on a piece of land, evaporated into medicine bottles and hospital bills that followed them like vultures. The dream of land became the desperate prayer for one more day. Her final days were in a cramped room that smelled of dust and decay. Elias held her hand, a hand that had once been so full of life, now frail and translucent. "Promise me, Elias," she had whispered, her breath a fragile wisp of air. "Promise me Maya won't live this life. Promise me she'll have a home, that she'll learn to read the books I never could." He had looked from his wife's fading eyes to his daughter, sleeping in a makeshift cradle in the corner, and a vow was forged in his soul, sealed by a tear that fell onto Maria's hand. "I promise," he said, the words a raw, painful prayer. "She will have a better life. She will be safe." It was the most important promise he had ever made, and it became the new horizon he would travel toward. After Maria was gone, the world felt hollow. The silence he had once used as a shield, now a suffocating emptiness. He packed their few belongings, took Maya by the hand, and left the road for good. He was looking for a place to keep his promise. He was looking for Harmony Creek. On the map, it was just a dot. To Elias, it was a name that sounded like a prayer answered. Harmony, a place to be still, a place to be safe. When they arrived, with less than $5 in his pocket, the town seemed to live up to its name. It was quiet, nestled, in a valley that seemed to protect it from the noise of the outside world. The people were reserved, but not unkind, their faces weathered by the same sun and worry he had known his whole life. Samuel Blackwood gave him a job and the small shack at the edge of his property. It wasn't much, but it was the first real home Maya had ever known. For 5 years, Elias worked to become part of that harmony. He was the first man on the fields and the last to leave. When a piece of machinery broke, it was Elias who was called day or night to coax it back to life. He never complained. He took his meager wages, bought groceries at the general store, and spent the rest of his time with Maya. He would sit with her for hours as she did her schoolwork, his large, calloused finger tracing the words she was learning to read, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He was keeping his promise. Maya was safe. She was learning. She had a home. He believed his work, his steady and unwavering reliability, would speak for him. He believed that in a place like this, a man's character was built not by what he said, but by what he did. But Harmony Creek had its own language, and it was not one Elias understood. It was a language of whispers, of long glances over picket fences, of histories that went back generations. He was an outsider, a man with no family name to anchor him, no shared stories from the town's past. His silence was not seen as dignity, but as secrecy. His frugality, born of a lifetime of poverty, was not seen as prudence, but as hoarding. He was a blank space in their history, and in a town that feared the unknown, people were all too willing to write their own story over his. They saw a man who kept to himself, and they wondered what he was hiding. They saw a man who never spoke of his past, and they assumed it must be a dark one. The town's anxieties were a dry field of grass, waiting for a spark. The harvest had been poor, the rains had come too late, and the dust on the roads seemed thicker than ever, a constant reminder of their precarious existence. Men gathered at the saloon, their talk growing darker, their fears searching for a target. They spoke of Blackwood's son, Thomas, a young man with a weak chin and an arrogant swagger. They whispered about his trips to the city, the flashy clothes he wore, the rumors of gambling debts that followed him like a stray dog. Samuel Blackwood, a man whose pride was as vast as his land, refused to see the rot in his own bloodline. He saw only a son who needed to find his way, not a man sliding into a hole of his own digging. And have you ever felt that shift, that almost imperceptible change in the air around you when suspicion takes root? It's not a single event, it's 1,000 tiny cuts. It was the way Mrs. Gable at the general store would suddenly get busy when Elias came to the counter. It was the way other farmers would stop talking when he approached the feed co-op. It was the day Maya came home from school, her eyes red from crying because the other children had called her father a strange and scary man. Each cut was a fresh wave of pain for Elias. He didn't understand. He had done nothing but work. He had wronged no one. He retreated further, his confusion and hurt building a new wall around him, a wall his neighbors mistook for guilt. The real poison began with Thomas Blackwood. Desperate to cover his debts, he saw an easy target, the quiet farmhand who lived alone, the man no one really knew. It was a simple, cruel plan. After losing the last of his money in a card game, he returned to the farm in the dead of night, pried open his father's cash box, and took everything. He then took the empty box and buried it in the soft earth behind Elias's shack, a place where a child's forgotten toys lay scattered. The next day, the whispers he had started began to take on a venomous new life. Funny how Elias never seems to need anything, he'd say to a group of men at the saloon, feigning thoughtfulness. A man with a daughter to raise, you'd think he'd be struggling like the rest of us. He planted the seeds, and in the fertile ground of the town's fear, they grew into monstrous certainties. When Samuel Blackwood discovered the theft, his rage was biblical. His life's work, the symbol of his power and security, was gone. For him, there was no room for doubt, no need for proof. His son, with a well-practiced look of concern, simply had to point him in the direction the whispers were already blowing. The story fit perfectly with their preconceived notions of the silent outsider. Of course it was him, the man who kept to himself, the man with no past, the man who wasn't one of them. The accusation was not a question to be investigated, it was a fact to be acted upon. The fear of a hard winter, the simmering resentments, the need for a simple answer to a devastating problem, it all coalesced into a single, unified purpose, to purge the threat from their midst. Elias knew none of this. He only knew that on the night the mob came, he had spent hours in the barn, his hands covered in grease, meticulously fixing the main axle on Blackwood's largest tractor. It was a complex job, one no one else could do, and he had worked until his muscles ached, driven by his ingrained sense of duty. He had cleaned his hands as best he could, and then gone to help Maya with her reading, her small voice sounding out the words, a beacon of light in his weary world. He had felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had done a good day's work. He had been a good father. He was, in that moment, at peace. That peace was shattered by the splintering of his door and the sight of the torches. As he was dragged out into the cold night, the faces he saw in the crowd were not those of strangers. They were the men he worked alongside every day, the women who nodded to him in town, the people he had believed were his neighbors. And in their eyes, he saw no recognition, no doubt, no mercy. He saw only the reflection of their own fear, twisted into a mask of absolute certainty. He was no longer Elias, the mechanic, the father. He was the thief, the outsider, the source of all their problems. The promise he had made to his dying wife, the very foundation of his life for the past 5 years, was being torn apart by the hands of the very community he had tried so hard to join. The past and the present were now crashing together in a single, unbearable moment. The silence he had cultivated his whole life had failed him. The hard work that was meant to be his testimony had been ignored. Everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed for, was turning to dust in the flickering torchlight. As the rope tightened around his neck, he understood a terrible truth about Harmony Creek, and perhaps about the world itself, that a lie shouted by many can easily drown out a truth whispered by one. But what no one in that furious crowd could possibly know was that Elias's whispered truth had left a mark, a small greasy smudge on a page in a child's schoolbook, a truth that was waiting in the hands of the one person who had looked past the silence and seen the man. The rope tightening around Elias's neck was not the beginning of the assault, but the end of a slow and deliberate strangulation of his character, a process that had started weeks before, not with a roar, but with a whisper. It began in the place where most of Harmony Creek's fears were given voice, the dim, smoky confines of the town saloon. Thomas Blackwood sat at a corner table, the smell of cheap whiskey on his breath and the cold sweat of desperation on his brow. The cards in his hand were a losing hand, just like the one before it and the one before that. Across the table, a man with eyes as hard and empty as river stones watched him, a thin smile playing on his lips. This was not a friendly game. This was the cashing in of a debt, and Thomas had nothing left to give. His father's generosity had run dry, and his own recklessness had dug a hole so deep he could no longer see the light. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. He needed money, and he needed it now. It was in that moment of pure, selfish terror that the idea took root, a poisonous weed in the barren soil of his soul. He thought of the quiet man, the outsider, the farmhand who lived at the edge of his father's property. Elias, the perfect scapegoat, a man with no history in the town, no one to speak for. Him, a man whose silence could be painted any color Thomas chose. The plan, born of cowardice and cruelty, bloomed in his mind, fully formed. That night, under the cover of a new moon, he moved like a phantom across the familiar land. He forced the lock on his father's office, his hands shaking not with fear of being caught, but with the thrill of his own dark solution. He took the metal box, heavy with the town's hope, and emptied its contents into a sack. Then he walked the short distance to Elias's shack, the silence of the night his only accomplice. He used a small spade to dig a shallow hole behind the woodpile, a place where Maya's small, forgotten dolls lay half buried in the dirt, and he placed the empty box inside, covering it with loose soil, burying an innocent man's future along with it. The next day the performance began. Thomas was no longer the sullen, resentful son. He was a pillar of the community, his voice laced with a newfound, false concern. He leaned against the counter at the general store, his words pitched just loud enough for the men gathered there to hear. "It's a tough year," he'd sigh, shaking his head. "Don't know how folks are going to make it through the winter." He'd pause, letting the weight of the shared anxiety settle in the room. Then he'd add, almost as an afterthought, "Funny thing, though, you see that Elias? Man never seems to want for anything. Quiet as a church mouse, but he and his girl are always fed. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" It was a simple, venomous question, not an accusation, but it was a spark, and the air in Harmony Creek was as dry as kindling. The men, their own faces etched with worry over the failing crops, exchanged glances. They had wondered. They just hadn't said it out loud. Now the son of the most powerful man in the county had given them permission. The poison spread quickly, seeping into the cracks of the community. It was a change Elias felt before he understood it. It was in the way Mrs. Gable, a woman who had always had a kind word for Maya, suddenly found a shelf that needed stocking the moment he walked into the store, leaving him standing at the counter in a pool of awkward silence. It was in the way the other farmers at the feed co-op, men he'd shared a nod and a weary smile with for 5 years, would fall silent when he approached, their conversations resuming only after he had loaded his sacks and driven away. The space around him grew wider, colder. He was becoming a ghost in his own life, a presence people looked through rather than at. He would lie awake at night, the creak of the shack's thin walls, a symphony of his isolation, and ask the darkness the same question over and over. What did I do? He had no answer. He had done nothing but work, nothing but try to build a safe world for his daughter within the four walls of their home. Have you ever been on the outside of a joke you don't understand? A secret everyone seems to share but you? Now imagine that joke is your life, your character, your very soul. Imagine the whispers follow you down the street. The turned backs feel like a physical blow. It is a unique and terrible kind of torture, to be judged and condemned by a jury that never convenes, for a crime that is never named. You begin to doubt yourself, to search your own past for some forgotten sin that could possibly justify the coldness in the eyes of your neighbors. This was Elias's new reality, a prison of suspicion, where every quiet moment, every humble act, was twisted into further proof of his supposed guilt. The cruelty found its most painful target, not in him, but in Maya. She came home from school one afternoon, her small shoulders slumped, her bright eyes clouded with a hurt too big for her little body. She didn't cry, not at first. She simply sat at their small wooden table, tracing patterns in the dust on its surface with her finger. Elias knelt beside her, his large, rough hand gently touching her hair. "What is it, Mija?" he asked, his voice soft. That was all it took. The tears came then, silent and hot, carving clean paths down her dusty cheeks. She told him, in a choked whisper, that the other children wouldn't play with her anymore. They had called her father a bad man, a strange man. They had said he had secrets. They had used the word thief. The word hung in the air between them, ugly and sharp. In that moment, Elias felt a pain far worse than any physical blow. The walls he had built to protect her had been breached, and the world's ugliness had found her. He felt the weight of his promise to Maria, the promise to keep her safe, and it felt like a stone in his gut. He was failing. That night, his internal conflict became a raging storm. He looked around the small shack, at the few meager possessions they owned, at the stack of books he'd bought for Maya, and he felt an overwhelming urge to run, to pack their things and disappear back onto the open road, back to the life of anonymity he had tried so desperately to escape. At least there, people's indifference was honest. It wasn't this smiling, whispering hatred that wore the mask of community. He was trapped. To stay meant enduring this slow poisoning, watching it infect his daughter. To leave meant admitting defeat, becoming the rootless drifter they already believed him to be. He felt a profound, soul-crushing shame, though he had done nothing to earn it. The silence he had always worn as a shield now felt like a confession. His inability to speak the language of these people, to defend himself against shadows, had rendered him utterly powerless. The breaking point came a week later. Samuel Blackwood, his face a thundercloud of rage, burst out of his office, a splintered wooden cash box in his hand. It was empty. His roar of fury could be heard all the way to the barns. He was a man whose entire identity was built on control, on the idea that his land and his property were extensions of his own formidable will. This theft was not just a financial loss. It was a personal violation, an act of defiance against his authority. He stormed through the farm, his eyes scanning for a target for his rage, and there was Thomas, his face a perfect mask of shock and concern, ready with the lie he had been rehearsing for days. "Father," he said, his voice trembling with feigned reluctance, "I don't want to say anything, but maybe you should talk to Elias. I saw him near the woodpile behind his shack late the other night. He was digging." It was all Samuel Blackwood needed to hear. The whispers he had dismissed as town gossip now solidified into hard fact in his mind. The outsider, the silent man. It made perfect sense. The anger and paranoia that had been simmering in the town now had a name and a face. He didn't need proof. His own certainty was enough. He bellowed for his foreman, for the other hands. "Get your torches," he commanded, his voice a raw, terrifying sound of absolute authority. "The thief is not getting away with this." The call went out, spreading from the farm to the town like a wildfire. Men, their own fears stoked by the bad harvest and the prospect of a hungry winter, grabbed whatever they could, pitchforks, hunting rifles, and torches that dripped fire onto the dry ground. They were no longer individuals. They were a single body, a mob moving with one mind, one purpose. Elias was inside the shack, helping Maya sound out the words in a new book Sarah, the schoolteacher, had given her. It was a moment of peace, a small island of normalcy in a sea of growing anxiety. He heard the noise first, a low rumble like distant thunder, Then he saw the light, an unnatural flickering orange that danced against their window pane. He stood up, his heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He moved to the door and peered through a crack in the wood. The sight that met his eyes stole the breath from his lungs. It was a sea of faces, faces he knew, but they were twisted by shadows and rage into something unrecognizable. They were the faces of monsters, and they were coming for him. He had just enough time to push Maya behind him, to whisper, "Stay back," before the door to his home, the one sanctuary he had in the world, splintered inward off its hinges. The noise was a violent explosion that shattered the quiet of their small life forever. Men poured into the room, their hands grabbing at him, their voices a cacophony of hate-filled accusations. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. His body went limp, his mind reeling in a state of shock so profound it was almost peaceful. He was being dragged out of his home, his boots scraping against the floorboards he had so carefully repaired. He was pulled out into the cold night air, into the center of a circle of fire and fury. The moment he was thrown to the ground, the dirt of Harmony Creek filling his mouth, he knew that his attempt to find peace was over. He had tried to outrun the ghosts of his past, but he had run straight into a nightmare. He looked up, past the angry faces and the burning torches, and saw the ancient oak tree at the edge of the clearing, its branches like the gnarled fingers of a skeleton, reaching for the starless sky. A thick rope was already being uncoiled. He realized then, with a clarity that was both terrifying and absolute, that these men, his neighbors, had not come for a confession. They had come for a sacrifice, and as he lay there, helpless and alone, he understood that the silence of Harmony Creek was not peaceful. It was the silence of the grave. The world for Elias was shrinking to a single point of searing pain and suffocating darkness. The rough hemp of the rope was a circle of fire around his neck, and the sounds of the mob, the crackle of the torches, the shuffling of boots on the dry earth, all began to fade into a distant underwater roar. His feet scraped uselessly against the ground, his lungs burning for an air that would not come. In the black bursting starfield of his fading vision, he saw only one thing: Maya's face, a pale, terrified moon in the doorway of their shack. He had failed her. His promise to Maria was dying with him, choked out by a lie in a town that called itself Harmony. He was a breath away from the end, a heartbeat from the final silence, when a sound cut through the night, sharp and clear as breaking glass. It was not a man's roar or a woman's scream. It was a word. "Wait!" The word, spoken with a voice that was trembling but full of an unyielding authority, was so unexpected that the two men holding the rope instinctively paused. Their muscles, tensed for the final brutal pull, went slack for a fraction of a second. The mob, a single mindless beast just moments before, fractured. Heads turned, their expressions of bloodlust momentarily replaced by sheer, dumbfounded confusion. Through the wall of broad shoulders and angry faces, a figure pushed her way forward. It was Sarah, the town's schoolteacher. She was not a large woman, her frame slight against the burly farmers, but she moved with a purpose that parted the crowd like a ship's bow through water. In her hand, she held not a weapon, but a small, mud-caked book, holding it up as if it were a shield against the wall of fire and hate. She came to a stop in the small clearing of space between the mob and Samuel Blackwood, her chest heaving, her eyes wide but locked on the landowner's stony face. The torchlight illuminated the fear on her features, but it also showed a fierce, defiant resolve. "You have to stop," she pleaded, her voice gaining strength. "You are making a terrible mistake." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Who was this woman, this teacher of children, to interrupt their justice? Blackwood took a step toward her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "This is not your concern, schoolteacher," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Go back to your books and leave the affairs of men to us." But Sarah did not retreat. She held the book out further, its worn cover and dirt-smudged pages a stark contrast to the raw violence of the scene. "This book is my concern," she declared, her voice ringing with a conviction that silenced the murmurs. "And it is his." She opened the small ledger, her fingers shaking slightly as she found the page she was looking for. "This is Maya's school ledger," she announced to the silent, watching faces. "I give the children practice assignments. Last night, the assignment was for them to have a parent practice writing their name alongside them." She turned the book so the torchlight fell upon the open page. There, next to a child's simple crayon drawing of a stick-figure family, was a name written in a clumsy, almost unreadable scrawl, Elias. The letters were misshapen, the work of a hand more accustomed to the heft of a wrench than the delicacy of a pencil, and across the bottom of the page, smearing the drawing and the signature, was a dark, unmistakable smudge. It was the greasy black fingerprint of a man who had spent his hours not with stolen money, but with the guts of a machine. "Look at it," Sarah's voice rose, cutting through the thick, tense air. "That is axle grease. Mr. Blackwood, your main tractor, the big one, it broke down yesterday afternoon. The axle seized. Everyone knows it." She pointed a trembling finger from the book to Elias, who was now hanging limply, gasping for air, as the pressure on his neck had slightly eased. "His hands were covered in it when he came to pick up Maya after school. He told me he would be working on it all night. He was worried you would lose another day's work." The words fell into the silence, each one a stone dropped into a still pond. The logic was simple, direct and unshakable. A man fixing a complex piece of machinery until late into the night, his hands covered in its evidence, could not have been sneaking through the darkness to dig up a hidden cash box. The mob's simple, satisfying narrative of guilt had just been shattered by a simple, inconvenient truth. A profound and uneasy quiet descended upon the clearing. The beast was no longer a single entity. It had broken back down into its individual parts. Farmers, shopkeepers, fathers, husbands. Men began to look at one another, not with shared purpose, but with a dawning, sickening uncertainty. The torchlight, which moments before had illuminated righteous fury, now revealed faces etched with doubt. They looked from the greasy smudge in the child's book to Elias's own hands, still stained with the dark grease from his labor. They looked at the rope, at the ancient oak tree, and then at their own hands. And for the first time, many of them seemed to see what they were truly doing. They were not instruments of justice. They were a lynch mob, seconds away from murdering a man based on a whisper and a powerful man's rage. The heat from the torches suddenly felt less like the fire of conviction and more like the flush of a terrible collective shame. And you, watching this story unfold, ask yourself this. In that moment, surrounded by the anger of your friends and neighbors, with the most powerful man in your world telling you that your rage is justified, would you have the courage to be that one voice? Would you have the strength to stand against the roar of a crowd that has already made up its mind, knowing that their fury could turn on you in a heartbeat? It takes a unique kind of bravery to speak a quiet truth in the middle of a loud lie. It is the courage of a schoolteacher, with nothing but a child's book, and it is a courage that can change the world, or at least the fate of one good man on one dark night. Sarah possessed that courage, and its light was now forcing everyone in that clearing to look into the darkness of their own hearts. As the seed of doubt took root, the crowd's attention began to drift, searching for a new focus for their unease. Their eyes, one by one, turned away from Elias. They scanned the edges of the circle, past the grim face of Samuel Blackwood, and settled on a figure who had been trying to remain unnoticed in the shadows. It was Thomas. He stood half-hidden behind the broad back of another farmer, his face the color of chalk, a sheen of cold sweat glistening on his brow in the firelight. He had been watching the proceedings with a kind of detached horror, the architect of a monstrous event that had taken on a life of its own. Now the collective gaze of the town, a heavy, suffocating weight was falling upon him. He visibly flinched, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal looking for an escape that did not exist. Samuel Blackwood, his authority crumbling, followed the gaze of his men. He turned and saw his son, and for the first time that night, the iron mask of his certainty cracked. He saw not the concerned son who had pointed him toward the outsider, but a pale, terrified young man shrinking from the light. He saw the gambler. He saw the liar. A new and far more terrible suspicion, a suspicion he had refused to entertain for months, began to claw its way into his mind. The whispers he had heard in town about Thomas's debts, whispers he had dismissed as jealous gossip, now returned with the force of a physical blow. He looked from his son's panicked face back to the greasy smudge on the ledger, and the two images collided in his mind, forming a new, horrifying picture of the truth. Fadi. Silence in the clearing was now heavier and more terrifying than the mob's earlier rage. It was a silence pregnant with an unspoken question. The rope was still around Elias's neck, a grim reminder of how close the town had come to an irrevocable sin. He was breathing now, ragged, painful gasps, his eyes slowly regaining focus, filled with a confusion that was slowly being replaced by a dawning, fragile hope. Sarah stood her ground, the small book still held before her like a sacred text. The entire town of Harmony Creek stood frozen at a precipice, balanced on the knife's edge between a lie that had almost destroyed a man and a truth that was about to destroy a family. The thread of justice, thin and frayed, had been caught at the last possible second, but what was about to unravel in the coming moments would change the fabric of their community forever. The air in the clearing, once filled with the roar of a mob and the crackle of fire, was now so quiet you could hear the blood pounding in your own ears. It was a silence far heavier, far more damning than the noise it had replaced. It was the silence of 100 souls simultaneously realizing the monstrous shape of their own sin. The collective gaze of the crowd, a physical and undeniable force, lifted from the gasping, half-hanged figure of Elias and swung as if pulled by a single string to the edge of the clearing. It settled upon Thomas Blackwood, who seemed to shrink in the sudden, absolute attention, the torchlight carving his pale face into a mask of pure animal panic. His father, Samuel Blackwood, stood like a statue carved from granite, his world tilting on its axis. The greasy smudge on the page of the child's book was an irrefutable fact, a small, dirty truth that had just demolished the mountain of his certainty. He looked at his son, truly looked at him, and for the first time, he did not see his bloodline, his legacy, his name. He saw a cornered rat. He saw the weak chin, the shifty eyes, the sheen of cold sweat that had nothing to do with the heat of the torches. The whispers he had so proudly dismissed as the jealous ramblings of lesser men now returned to him as a chorus of screaming accusations inside his own head. The trips to the city, the new clothes, the rumors of debt. Each memory was another nail being hammered into the coffin of his pride. Slowly, deliberately, Samuel Blackwood began to move. Each step he took toward his son was an eternity, the crunch of his boots on the dry ground the only sound in the universe. The crowd parted before him, a silent, shameful sea. He reached Thomas, who was trembling so violently it seemed his bones might shake loose from his skin. Samuel's hand, a thick, powerful thing that had built an empire of dirt and fear, rose and clamped down on his son's arm. The grip was not that of a father but of a jailer, his fingers digging into the soft flesh, an anchor of terrible reality. His voice, when it came, was not a roar. It was lower, more dangerous than any shout had ever been. It was a sound like stones grinding together in the dark. What did you do? The question was not a question. It was a verdict. Under the crushing weight of his father's grip and the unbearable pressure of 100 pairs of eyes, Thomas shattered. The carefully constructed facade of the concerned son, the loyal heir, dissolved into the pathetic, whimpering truth of who he was. A sob, raw and ugly, tore from his throat. It was the sound of a complete and total unraveling. Words began to spill out of him, a torrent of confession and self-pity, each sentence another shovelful of dirt on the grave of his family's name. The debts, he choked, tears and mucus streaming down his face, a grotesque sight in the firelight. I owed money, a lot of money, to men in the city. They were going to hurt me, Father. I didn't know what to do. He confessed it all. The desperate late-night ride back from the city after losing the last of his father's money. The cold, calculated decision to steal the harvest savings. The cruel, simple idea of blaming the one man no one would speak for. He described how he had forced the lock on his father's office, his hands shaking not with guilt, but with a pathetic thrill. He told them how he had buried the empty box behind Elias's shack, the soft thud of the metal against the earth, a sound of temporary salvation. He even confessed to starting the whispers himself, to poisoning the well of the town's opinion, turning their fear into his weapon. He was not a cunning villain, he was a coward, and his confession was the final, desperate act of a boy who had just realized the game was over. As the last of his choked words faded into the night, the moral implosion was complete. The crowd did not gasp, they did not shout. A wave of sickness seemed to pass through them. The fury they had felt just minutes before, a feeling so pure and righteous, was now revealed to be a cheap and ugly thing, a puppet's rage manipulated by the strings of a coward. One by one, as if by some unspoken command, the torches began to go out. A man would look at the flame in his hand, see the reflection of his own contorted face, and with a flick of his wrist, plunge it into the dirt. The sound of the hissing embers was the sound of shame. The light receded, the dancing shadows vanished, and the clearing was returned to the cold, honest, and unforgiving light of the moon. In the renewed darkness, a farmer, his face a mask of profound regret, stepped forward with a hunting knife. He did not look at Elias as he sawed through the thick rope, the fibers parting with a final rasping groan. Elias fell to his knees, his body a dead weight, his hands flying to his throat. He coughed, a deep rattling sound as air, precious and sharp, flooded his burning lungs. He remained on the ground for a long moment, the dust of Harmony Creek on his hands and knees, his head bowed not in defeat, but in the simple, overwhelming agony of survival. The world was slowly coming back into focus, no longer a pinprick of fading light, but a stark tableau of shame-faced men and dying fires. He did not look at Samuel Blackwood, who stood frozen, his hand still on his son's arm. A man who had just discovered the rot was not in his fields, but in his own house. He did not look at Thomas, who was now weeping openly, a broken and pathetic figure. He did not look at the faces of the men who had been ready to end his life. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady, and his gaze found the one thing in the world that mattered. Maya was still in the doorway, her small body rigid, her eyes wide pools of a horror no child should ever witness. Elias took a step, then another, his body moving as if through deep water, his every muscle screaming in protest. He walked the longest 10 yards of his life, back toward the home they had tried to tear him from. The crowd remained silent, their shame a palpable thing. In the air, a wall he passed through without acknowledgement. He reached the doorway and knelt before his daughter. He said nothing. He simply opened his arms. For a moment, she remained frozen, as if seeing a ghost. Then, with a small, broken cry, she launched herself into his embrace, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck, her face burying itself in his shoulder. Elias held her, his own body trembling with the aftershocks of what had happened, and he closed his eyes. He held the only thing that had ever been real, the only promise that had ever mattered. His silence was his verdict on them all. It was more powerful, more damning than any curse he could have uttered. The mob, no longer a mob, but a collection of broken and ashamed individuals, began to dissolve. They melted back into the darkness from which they had come, their pitchforks and rifles now feeling heavy and obscene in their hands. They walked away not in groups, but alone, each man isolated in the prison of his own conscience. They would go home to their wives and children, but they would not be able to look them in the eye. They had gone out that night to hunt a monster, and in the process they had found the monster living inside themselves. The clearing was soon empty, save for 3 figures, Elias holding his daughter, Sarah the schoolteacher, standing like a lone sentinel, and Samuel Blackwood, a king whose castle had just crumbled to dust around him, his worthless heir still weeping at his side. In the days that followed, a new kind of silence fell over Harmony Creek. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of guilt. Thomas was sent away, disappearing in the dead of night, disowned and banished, his name never to be spoken again in his father's house. But that was a quiet, private justice. The true punishment was public, and it was reserved for Samuel Blackwood. He had been the town's anchor, its unshakable center of gravity. Now, he was a ghost. When he walked down the main street, conversations would stop. People would cross to the other side to avoid his path. His authority, which had been as solid as the earth he owned, had evaporated overnight. He had turned his neighbors into a lynch mob, and it was a sin the town could not forgive, because to forgive him would be to forgive themselves, and they were not ready for that. A week after that night, Samuel Blackwood walked the path to Elias's shack. He looked older, his broad shoulders stooped, the iron certainty in his eyes replaced by a haunted, hollow look. He found Elias mending a fence post, his movements slow but steady, the familiar rhythm of work a balm for his bruised soul. Blackwood stopped a few feet away, holding a thick envelope in his hand. "Elias," he said, his voice rough, unused. There are no words. What I did, what I almost allowed to happen." He trailed off, the apology dying in his throat, inadequate and insulting. He held out the envelope. "This is money, enough to buy a real farm, a new house, anything you want, please take it." Elias stopped his work. He slowly turned, his eyes meeting Blackwood's. There was no hatred in his gaze, no anger. There was something far worse, a profound and unshakable pity. He looked at the envelope, then back at the man who had tried to take everything from him. He simply shook his head, a small, quiet gesture. "I don't want your money, Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice calm and clear. He didn't need to say more. The refusal was absolute. It was not an act of pride or a desire for revenge. It was a simple statement of fact. What had been taken from him, his peace, his safety, his daughter's innocence, could not be repaid with cash. His dignity was not for sale. He turned back to his work, hammering a nail into the post with a clean final strike. Samuel Blackwood stood there for a long moment, the envelope still outstretched, a man offering a meaningless currency to someone who possessed a wealth he could never understand. Then he turned and walked away, a king in exile in his own kingdom. Life in Harmony Creek found a new, fragile rhythm. Sarah, the schoolteacher, was now regarded with a kind of awe, a woman whose courage had saved them all from themselves. Elias and Maya were no longer the strange outsiders. They were treated with a quiet, solemn respect. People would nod to him in town, their eyes holding an apology they could not speak. Mrs. Gable from the general store would always give Maya an extra piece of candy, her hands trembling slightly as she did. They were no longer invisible. They were a living, breathing reminder of the town's darkest night and of the quiet strength that had overcome it. Elias did not ask for their friendship, nor did he refuse their quiet acts of penance. He simply continued to work, to raise his daughter, to keep the promise he had made to his wife. He never owned a large plot of land. He never became a wealthy man. But in the years that followed, he built a life. He watched Maya grow, her love for books blossoming under Sarah's guidance. He saw her become a young woman with a quick mind and a compassionate heart, a heart that had seen the worst of people but had chosen to believe in the best. He had given her a home. He had kept her safe. His hands, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of labor, had built a future far richer than any Samuel Blackwood could have offered. His victory was not loud or triumphant. It was quiet, steady, and enduring like the ancient oak tree that still stood at the edge of the clearing, a silent witness to the night that truth, armed with nothing but a greasy fingerprint, had spoken louder than an entire town's rage. How many times in our own lives are we put into a cage not of our own making, a cage built by the whispers of others, by the judgments of people who don't know our story, by the fears of a world that is quick to condemn what it does not understand. We can rattle the bars, we can scream our innocence, but sometimes the only thing that can set us free is the quiet, stubborn truth of our own character. Elias's story is a reminder that integrity is a silent force, a light that can burn steadily in the darkest of nights, and that while a lie can gather a crowd, the truth will eventually always find its voice. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest strength is found not in shouting, but in enduring, in continuing to be who we are until the world is forced to see it. If this story spoke to the part of you that has ever felt misunderstood, judged, or wrongly accused, if you have ever had to fight to have your truth heard against a chorus of doubt, then let us know. There is a powerful solidarity in shared experience. If you have ever lived through your own dark night and come out into the light, write in the comments, "I have also lived a turning point." Because every story of resilience shared is another torch lit, not of anger, but of hope, in a world that desperately needs it.